Hi, everyone. This is Anthony Buglevine, the CEO of the Nonprofit Finance Fund, and I'm very excited to welcome everyone to our webinar on the State of the Nonprofit Sector Survey results. Thanks, everyone, for joining, and many of you who have joined us today also participated in the survey. I wanted to give a special thanks to those of you who took the time to fill out the survey. Your stories are very important to us and to the sector, and we appreciate not only the clarity of insight that you provide in filling out the survey, but also the time that many people took this year, about 2,000 people who, in addition to providing quantified answers to the survey, also provided narrative descriptions of the condition in which you find your organizations and your communities. And again, we wouldn't be able to do what we did without that support and that effort from many of you on this call. We are going to hear today from Kerry Sullivan of the Bank of America Foundation, as well as the team of the Nonprofit Finance Fund who helped to lead the survey. And we're going to get in a few minutes into the results of what the survey is telling us. Before we do that, I just wanted to take 1 minute to let the people on this call know the way in which the survey is being used already and how we anticipate the survey being used throughout the year and beyond. The survey results have already been sent to about 30,000 people through email. They were picked up on various relevant publications, including National Public Radio, the Huffington Post, and the Chronicle of Philanthropy. The survey has also, this is the 5th year of the survey, and especially in this last year, we anticipate again this year, this survey is increasingly becoming used by people in the nonprofit sector and those who fund it as a go-to resource to understand the state of the sector we're in. Last year, Independent Sector ran a Wall Street Journal op-ed that included references to data from the survey. The National Council of Nonprofits used survey results when testifying to the House Ways and Means Committee. And the White House Office of Social Innovation has taken interest in the survey this year, and we'll be meeting with them this week to discuss how we can use the data gathered and the insights it derives to understand the state of the sector and what we can do to improve it. And in addition, the survey is increasingly becoming used by foundations as well as nonprofit associations at the state level, again, to understand the state of our financial health, which we'll get into in a second. So before I do that, I did want to give a big thank you from the Nonprofit Finance Fund, and I really think from the sector as a whole, for the support that this survey and many other efforts have received from the Bank of America Charitable Foundation. And before I introduce Kerry Sullivan, just wanted to say thank you to Kerry and to her team for your ongoing support and your work and collaboration, not only in helping to fund this initiative, but really helping to generate significant interest among the nonprofit community in both providing responses to the survey and also making sure that the survey findings are widely distributed and influence the kinds of decisions that should be informed of this kind of data. So I want to turn it over to Kerry Sullivan, who is the president of the Bank of America Charitable Foundation. Many of you know that the Bank of America Charitable Foundation provides more than $200 million in annual philanthropic investments focused on strengthening the economic and social health of communities across the global footprint of Bank of America. In this role, Kerry leads a team that implements a broad range of national and international philanthropic programs associated with Bank of America's corporate responsibility initiatives more widely. So I just want to hand it over to Kerry, who will spend a few minutes talking about why the Bank of America Charitable Foundation is engaged in this effort, and then we'll get into the content of what we've learned this year.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. I'm sure we're all looking forward to an insightful conversation about the survey. And first of all, I'd like to thank you all for joining today's call. And I guess more importantly, thank you for the work that you're doing day in and day out in your communities. I know you're facing enormous challenges. And we know the work you do is so critical to improving the lives of individuals and families across the country and beyond. And as Anthony mentioned, before we really get started, I'd like to share a bit of background and set the context for our dialogue and why Bank of America has partnered with NFF on this survey. We all know that since 2008, the economy has been very challenged. And although we've recently seen some signs of economic growth, many low-income communities continue to face a very tough environment. And we know that nonprofits are working hard to meet a both heightened and continued demand for services with very limited resources. And we know that means you're probably struggling, many of you. And I wanted to just share a few statistics that sort of sets the context of the environment we're in. First of all, unemployment across the country remains high, about 7.6% in March. And in communities of color, unemployment is in the double digits. And with respect to young people, teens and young adults, it's at an all-time high. Unfortunately, roughly 1.3 million students drop out of school each year. And that's a consistent drumbeat for quite some time. And this is particularly alarming because the skills needed for 21st century jobs really require 2 years of post-secondary education or credentialing. According to the National Foundation for Credit Counseling, over 40% of adults have little to no financial skills. And against this backdrop, we know that nearly 50 million Americans are at risk of hunger. So it's not surprising, given all of that, and there are many more statistics that I didn't share, that nonprofits are fragile and are being asked to do more with less. At Bank of America, our philanthropic activities support our company's purpose, which is to make the lives of the customers and communities we serve better. And as a consumer bank, we're on, almost on every corner, and we have a large presence in communities. We work to create community connections through a range of activities, whether that be lending, investing, or volunteering. Our philanthropy and volunteering really focuses on 3 core issues, and we think they're core to the economic health of communities: housing, hunger, and jobs. I'd like to say a place to live, food on the table, and the opportunity to work. They're really essential. And we believe that providing support to these safety net issues, we can help jumpstart economies. So that's really our framework for our philanthropy. Our partnership with NFF is one of the ways we are working to strengthen the nonprofit sector, going beyond just simply providing grant support, but really looking at the issues of the sector as a whole. And as a corporate funder, we see the value of financial training and education for our nonprofit partners so that they can navigate through tough times to prepare for the future. And NFF does a lot of work in that arena. We have a robust partnership with nonprofit finance funds through our program-related investment activity with approximately $12 million in exposure currently. And we've worked with NFF to provide financial guidance to nonprofit leaders who are part of our Neighborhood Builders program with a focus on helping them adapt to the new normal. So we're really thrilled to sponsor the NFF survey for the 3rd consecutive year. We believe it's a diagnostic tool to help us approach our work in nonprofits so that we can work more in a more robust fashion together. We want to help foster dialogue that brings more transparency and authenticity to the funder-grantee conversations. And we continue to look for ways to connect with nonprofits in a more holistic partnership to drive impact. And part of that is to provide creative solutions to meet the demands that are before us in our communities. NSF survey really helps us be a more impactful partner, and I think it helps frame a conversation for all of us to engage in as we move forward. So again, thank you for joining the call, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from Anthony and his team, which I'm sure will have some great questions and stimulating discussions. So thank you, Anthony, and I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Carrie. And again, thanks to Bank of America for their support of this effort. I forgot to mention in my introduction that we are going to take time at the end of this call to answer questions from those of you listening. So if you do have any questions or any technical glitches we can deal with during the call, please do type into the GoToMeeting webinar questions section, which you should all have. And we will be scanning those for questions that we'll be taking at the end based on the survey. So with that introduction, let's actually get into the news of the day, which is what we learned about the state of the sector from the survey itself. So those of you following the computer, you'll see that we did have, in the last final tally, almost 6,000 complete responses. That represents about a 30% increase from last year, which was double the previous year. And at that level, we not only have, we think, some very strong national insights, but also the ability to break the sample down and derive insights at both the state, sector, and organizational size level, and we'll get into that during the webinar as well. So just want to spend 2 minutes, and then I'll be handing it over to the NFF team here to talk about the high-level themes. And this really resonates with Carrie's point about where we stand. We all know that there was, in the public media, there seems to be a sense that the financial crisis was both a financial crisis and also in the past. We hear about how the economic crisis has ended. For many of the nonprofits' responses in the survey, it's clear that, in fact, the crisis was not simply financial, and it certainly is not temporary. And while more organizations are breaking even, fewer organizations are doing very well. And the sense we have is that the sector itself is really facing a condition in which the need continues to rise, and it's harder than ever to keep up. And I think that's an important story that this survey says. It runs counter to the sense in the public media that perhaps the worst times are behind us. It's certainly not true in our nonprofit sector. Many of you all know on this call that you are facing higher demand than ever, and the ability of old ways of raising money, either from the private sector or from government, to keep up with the demand is simply not working. So the need continues to rise. At the same time that while some organizations are seeing slight improvements, the overall situation really remains one in which the sector itself is treading water and not really making progress. And then finally, what's interesting this year is a real sense that more and more organizations, and many of you on the call are probably experiencing this, have stopped waiting for things to get back to normal and have come to realize that we are entering the dawn of an era in which this level of resource scarcity and raised expectations on our organizations is normal and will be the condition we have to adapt to. And so some very interesting findings from the survey this year about exactly what organizations are doing to adapt in terms of both how they are raising resources and spending them to meet their missions. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Jen Talansky, the Head of Communications and Knowledge here at NFF, who's going to talk about exactly what data we have that gets us to understand the way that government funding is changing at the same time that the demand continues to increase.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. So why does this data matter so much? It matters because nonprofits are an engine in our society and of our economy as well. They employ 10.7 million people. And in many cases, these employees are providing vital services to vulnerable people. Just over half the organizations who responded to our survey self-identified as Lifeline, providing critical services to people in need. 6 in 10 of the respondents primarily serve people in low-income communities. Of all the survey respondents, 9 in 10, 90%, think 2013 will be as hard or harder for their clients than the prior year. We asked the respondents who primarily serve low-income communities about the primary needs for their clients. As you can see in the chart, jobs and housing are the top concerns. So now let's take a look at demand. Nonprofit financial health is only important if nonprofits are doing work that is useful to their communities. One clear measure of the usefulness of their work is demand. And judging by that, nonprofits are certainly doing valued and necessary work. Over 3/4 of our respondents saw an increase in demand last year for their services. For the year ahead, for 2013, 85% expect an increase in demand on top of last year's. So will nonprofits be able to keep up with demand? As we can see from the 2012 bar in this chart, for the first time since we began asking this question in the survey, over half were unable to keep up with the needs of their communities. 54% expect to have a problem keeping up in 2013. If we compare this to when we first asked this question for 2009, when 44% were unable to keep up with demand, we see a worrying trend here. This is not a growth pattern that you want to see. Frighteningly, the inability to keep up with demand is even worse for organizations, for lifeline organizations that provide critical services. 3 out of 5 of them couldn't keep up with demand in 2012, and 63% anticipate the same challenges in 2013. So data are always interesting, and they paint a nice overall picture. To me, some of the most interesting responses that we get to the survey are in the qualitative responses, where we ask people to talk about the greatest challenge that they have and how they're responding to it. And for me, I like this. It really gives sort of a flavor. It gives the stories behind the numbers, what people and organizations are living with and how they're coping. And we have here one of those responses in the orange. We are seeing an increasing need for food assistance among families that never before have accessed services. Many are currently working but not receiving wages high enough to make ends meet. Our organization has worked hard in the last 3 years to increase our food sources and capacity to distribute food to help alleviate the hunger need in our community. We have also significantly increased our efforts to enroll people in food stamps as a way to provide them with more resources for their household. This is an example of another disturbing trend that we see more in the quotes on the anecdotal side. New individuals and families, some of whom in fact in some cases used to be donors rather than users of services, are now turning to nonprofits for help. So government is obviously a huge part of the funding equation, particularly for social services. 29% of survey respondents received federal funding in 2012, and 47% received state or local contracts. The government contracts for services, do they pay the full cost of what they request? In the overwhelming majority of cases, they do not. Imagine going to a restaurant or to your accountant, we all just went through tax season, and telling them you only pay for part of the work you requested or part of the food that you ordered. That is essentially what's happening for 83% of federal contract recipients and 86% of state or local contract recipients. In addition, 1 in 3 organizations in our survey received less government money in 2012 than they did in 2011. So when does payment arrive from the government? For half of federal funding recipients and for 6 in 10 state or local funding recipients, the funding comes late. For this human service organization from Illinois, the situation is particularly challenging. We are funded by the state of Illinois. We cannot get our funds paid within 6 months without 6 months delay from the state. And you have to use a lobbyist to even get the state to pay out on its debt. We have to demonstrate that we have exhausted all resources, all reserves, completely maxed out on line of credit, and show that we cannot make the next payroll before Illinois will pay us the money owed to us. So how do organizations cope with late government payments? 55 to 56% dip into reserves, which if you do have reserves to dip into, is certainly a lesser issue than some of the other possibilities. Worse are the quarter who delay payments to their vendors, which of course has a trickle-down effect into the economy. And worst are the 3 to 6% who either reduce services or cut staff because of late government payment. For better or worse, we also see around 4 in 10 who at this point anticipate and plan for delayed payments. I'm now going to hand off to my colleague on our Knowledge and Communications team, Andrew Schwam, to talk about the cash situation of nonprofits.
Great. So as we saw on the last slide, the main response that organizations facing uneven cash flow from government, the main response they undertake is to call on cash reserves to help cover things like payroll, cover the rent of buildings, and pay for other recurring needs that don't fluctuate each month the way revenue does. But what our survey found was that this option isn't always available to an organization. We asked nonprofits to indicate how many months' worth of recurring expenses they could cover with existing cash reserves. As it turns out, fewer than half of all organizations had enough cash in reserve to cover more than 3 months' expenses. So extended delays on receivables from government and other sources mean overextended nonprofits. And that certainly contributed to the 60% of responding organizations who either just broke even or showed a deficit on their books in 2012. As we saw earlier, when funding doesn't cover the full cost of providing services, particularly from government, organizations may never catch up, and these structural deficits can eventually sink the enterprise. So in the survey this year, as we have in past years, we asked nonprofits to share what topics they felt most comfortable discussing with their funders. And these range. Of course, at NFF, let me try to speak up here a little bit. Thanks for the feedback from the audience. So as I said, in the survey this year, we asked nonprofits about the topics they felt comfortable talking with their funders about. And of course, we consider the development and maintenance of reserves to be a kind of a core financial need for healthy nonprofits. But when it comes to the conversations between nonprofits and their funders, developing reserves comes in third as a topic they're comfortable talking about. So there are probably a number of reasons for this, but a big part of our advisory work stems from our commitment to bolstering the confidence and financial storytelling ability of nonprofit staff. And that that confidence, that bolstered confidence, and the clarity that comes with a sort of with it and a good story about your finances can be exceedingly useful for guiding these conversations. But grant makers who care about the long-term sustainability of their grantees may need to take a little extra leap here and go out of their way to ensure that building reserves is a more central part of their conversations. So perhaps it's predictable that program expansion is far and away the #1 topic of comfort between nonprofits and their funders at 60%. But the second most common is facility needs. Safe and secure buildings are often critical resources for nonprofit service providers. But of course, we know that facility investments can contain their own hidden dangers. I mean, there's no disputing the need to fix a leaky roof after all. But the tangibility of these kinds of investments and their visible need can often help kick the can down the road on more substantial structural problems with an organization's finances. So my colleagues Rebecca Thomas and Rodney Christopher have occasionally called this focus on putting buildings ahead of other factors that contribute to organizational stability. They've called it our sector's edifice complex. But the point is that whatever the sources of discomfort in the conversations about nonprofits' core financial needs, the parties to these conversations will have to go the extra mile to make sure they happen. Or, in some cases, they'll need to seek assistance to make sure that those conversations happen, if they need. Of course, as many of you know firsthand, probably the greatest asset to our sector is its human capital. And despite steadily building financial strain, an enormous number of nonprofits, nearly half of those in our survey, saw the increasing need in our communities and were undeterred in adding or expanding existing programs. 41% of organizations served more people, and some 15% even moved into new geographical territory. So given the financial constraints, a big part of what is helping cover the gap, though not the only thing, as we'll see in a second, is the legendary sweat equity of the nonprofit workforce. So as sort of a side note, here in the orange, you can see we've got a quote from a human services organization. One thing everyone will be watching over the next couple of years, including this organization, to be sure, will be the effect of the Affordable Care Act on the sustainability of nonprofit organizations who increasingly rise to the challenge of meeting a new wave of demand for service. So while sweat equity seems to be an important part of how we keep patching the hole in the floor of the nonprofit sector, it's fortunately not the only resource nonprofits have at their disposal. There are new ways that nonprofits are finding efficiencies that let them keep delivering services. Our survey detected, for instance, significant enthusiasm for partnering with other organizations, both to improve or increase services and to reduce administrative expenses. And often this is by sharing back office functions, for example. And about a third of organizations reported investing in technology that improved services or was otherwise a source of greater efficiency. And recognizing that keeping our political leaders aware of the role of nonprofits in our communities is critical to their long-term sustainability, it's really great to see that 43% of organizations advocated to government on behalf of their cause. I think we're seeing, probably as you are, a number of relatively high-profile efforts to activate the nonprofit sector in this regard, and we think this will continue and grow for the foreseeable future as nonprofits really try to come out of the shadows and own their role in contributing to our shared social fabric. And finally, one other trend we think that will continue in the coming years is nonprofits pursuing innovative fundraising strategies and seeking non-traditional sources of investment. 24% of the organizations in our survey said they'd made changes to the way they raised or spent money in 2012, and 39% were planning to do so in 2013. About a fifth of organizations sought non-traditional funding, such as loans or other investments, in 2012, and about a quarter plan to do so in 2013. Now, there's a lot of innovation going on in this area right now, online fundraising platforms and things like that, and we're certainly keeping tabs on that. But the other thing that we're interested in certainly is that given the growing interest among more traditional funders and investors for finding innovative ways to get social returns on their capital, and then the growing receptivity that our survey reflects to non-traditional sources among nonprofits, we think that there may be opportunities to bring new people to the table, and this is a trend we'll be watching very, very closely at NFF in the next, over the next couple of years. So in the next couple of slides, my colleague Anjali Deshmukh is going to walk through what some of these innovations and adaptations have meant for organizations in our survey.
Thank you, Andrew. So as the sector has gone through a period of funding decline, funders and investors more and more are looking to spend their dollars where they believe that they will have the greatest long-term impact. This is leading to funds to support programs that focus on preventive services aimed at reducing a specific social challenge over a longer-term period. For example, programs that are designed to reduce the rates of homelessness over 5 to 10 years, or reduce rates of preventable health conditions. Pay for Success is one such funding program in which the government seeks to tie funding to program outcomes. And if you'd like to learn more about PFS, please check out our webinar this Friday, which will be discussing details on PFS funding in the 2004 federal budget proposal. Visit our site, payforsuccess.org, to learn more about this webinar as well as Pay for Success in general. So this new trend is calling on nonprofits to build their capacity and operations in new ways. In 2012, 54% of survey respondents were asked to measure impact by their funders. Just over half said that they regularly measure impact, while the remaining half had more sporadic efforts. With community needs so high, most organizations are required right now to focus on program delivery before investing in operations to measure long-term impact. We asked those that didn't measure impact regularly what prevented them from doing so. Lack of staff time, technology, money were some of the main reasons that organizations were struggling to regularly measure impact. Also, 54% reported that their programs were not easily measurable. In the other category, the 9% at the bottom, many organizations noted that they couldn't control how long their clients stayed in their program, so it was very difficult to sort of assess how they were doing over a long-term period, and also that the number of societal factors that were affecting outcomes were out of their sphere of influence and impact, and even measurement. So how can organizations be successful in this new environment? We've seen in both our client work and in the survey that thriving organizations have some common characteristics. They're typically measuring impact more regularly and using their data to actually make organizational decisions. And in addition to decisions, they're actually, with growing concerns about the retreat of government funding, many are also tying their impact data to communications efforts and using communications to reach out to both government funders as well as new audiences, integrating data and success stories into a more sort of strategic message and strategic use of sort of the technological tools that they have available. They're also often collaborating to improve services and operations, whether through small partnerships or through more deep and integrated ones that affect organizational structure. They're also investing in examining or retooling their business models and planning for unexpected changes in funding. And lastly, we noticed, as Andrew mentioned earlier, that a lot of organizations that are a little bit more successful are engaging in field-wide conversations and helping to shape funding policies. On the funder side, we're also seeing some emerging characteristics. More and more funders are considering providing funding to help nonprofits invest in operations upgrades that will allow them to better measure their impact. So this may take the form of actually feasibility assessments or actual technology upgrades. They're also facilitating nonprofit explorations of mergers and collaborations. So one such example of this is the Boston Catalyst Fund. We're also seeing funders providing specific funding to support organizational change, what NFF calls change capital. These funds are specifically intended to help organizations take the time to strategically rethink their operations and plan for new ways of doing business. So these are just a few of the solutions that we delve into in greater depth on our website. To read more about the survey, do visit us online at nonprofitfinancefund.org/survey. And we had a question from the audience about whether we have information available based on sector or size. And you can absolutely find that information online. If you're interested in even actually delving deeper on your own, please do visit our survey analyzer at survey.nonprofitfinancefund.org. This is a very fun tool that we created this year and last year that allows users to slice the data on their own by sector, geography, annual expense, among a few other characteristics. And we'll also be posting at nonprofitfinancefund.org/survey in a few weeks the webinar recording, and you'll also find there right now an extended version of this current PowerPoint that you're viewing today. So thank you for joining us on this call, and we'll be spending a few minutes taking questions, and Anthony will wrap up.
Great. Thanks so much, Anjali. We have received some very interesting questions, and I do encourage anyone with additional questions to submit them over the email. It's not the most organic way to have a conversation, but with hundreds of people on the call, it's the only feasible way to do so. So I wanted to just start with a few interesting questions we received, and I'll answer those, and then if there are additional ones, please submit them. So the first question was one that came from Jennifer Aronson. Thanks, Jennifer. I'm just asking about the methodology and the statistical significance of this sample. So just to say that, as I said, this year we were able to increase, with a lot of the help of those of you on the phone and others, the response rate up to almost 6,000 complete responses. We got responses from more than 6,000, but had to filter out those that were not complete. So that 6,000 is statistically significant in that we don't see much of a change in the answers as the sort of second, third, fourth, and 5,000 answers roll in. So on one hand, this is a very good representation, we believe, of the sample. I think the question on methodology is to what extent there is bias in our sample. Clearly, the 6,000 organizations nowhere near match the more than 1 million nonprofits we have in the U.S. We are able to say that this sample does reflect geographic, sectoral, and by size. We have the same percentage of respondents in California and New York as those states represent of the overall nonprofits in the U.S., and that's true in other states as well. We did receive data from all 50 states. This is not something that we did not apply a methodology that allowed us to be completely non-random in the sample. Just for those of you who follow these things, we do have on the website that Anjali mentioned a note about our methodology. This was a sample that was anyone could answer this survey, and it was pushed out over email and through the website. That methodology does allow us to be quite comfortable with some of the insights, but does have challenges, especially around year-to-year comparisons. With the help of Bank of America and distribution partners, GuideStar, as well as the some national and state nonprofit bodies, we are quite comfortable that what we've reached is not just a sample of our friends and family here at the Nonprofit Finance Fund, but quite a representative sample of nonprofits generally. And again, if you go on the survey analyzer that we've just posted the link to, you are able to filter the data yourselves by geography, by sector, and by size, and you will be able to determine for yourself the extent to which our sample is representative of the overall set of nonprofits. We have a sense that this probably undersamples very small nonprofits, but otherwise we do believe that it's quite representative. So thank you, Jennifer, for that question, and I do encourage you to look at the methodology page. Our view on this is we don't have the ability to make this perfect in terms of a representative sample, but we certainly want to be as transparent as possible. The second question we received was a point that Mike Vann made. So thank you, Mike, for that point you made. When we were talking about the difficulty that many nonprofits have in discussing finances, and especially things like financial reserves with their funders, Mike pointed out that many funders, especially small family foundations, lack the financial sophistication themselves to be able to enter into that conversation. I think that's a very good point. We believe that the kind of adaptation that's going to be necessary for the sector is not going to come simply from nonprofits being able to drive change ourselves, but it's really going to require a much better open dialogue about finances with our funders as well. And that will not be possible unless we improve the capacity of the entire system to understand and use finances. And certainly there's a lot of work that needs to be done with small family foundations and frankly even with large foundations, and I used to be a program officer at one of them, to help those people who are moving money into our sector better understand the importance of finances. And this sort of links to a final question that I will take, and then I'll turn to my colleagues to continue. And that came from David Policano, who asked whether the trend of the decrease in ability to meet demand would hold in a period of economic growth. And I think this is a very important point. We tend to historically think of our nonprofit sector as being somewhat cyclical, and that when the economy goes down, we have the unenviable task of seeing demand go up at the same moment that there's less money in the system to fund it. And then we expect that when the economy gets rolling again, funding comes back and demand goes down. And I think certainly that is a trend that has held in the past. We believe, not only from the data from this 5 years worth of the survey, but also from our own work independently and our work with clients, that there's something different going on right now, and that even as the economy has recovered, and the unemployment numbers that Carrie began with are terrible, but they're better than they have been in the last year or two, that despite the economy going up and unemployment going down over the last few years, we continue to see year on year an increase in the demand for services. And so while it might have held true historically that economic growth has a knock-on effect in helping to stabilize the financing of the nonprofit sector, we do not believe that it's prudent to wait for that to happen again this year. And as we said, and it's not just us at NFF who believe this, but more and more of the survey respondents are taking a similar view that the structural nature of inequality in our society, the nature of employment, that even people with jobs are increasingly needing social services, and the demographic trends that are going to commandeer more and more of our government money for health care, that those combined, we believe, have created the conditions under which even economic growth and lower unemployment will not change the fundamental fact that our organizations and the nonprofit organizations are being asked to do more and are not going to be able to rely on the old ways of working. And so the last thing I would say about that is it really gets back to the last point we made in the presentation, which is the need for many organizations, both nonprofits and their funders, to invest in adaptation. And a challenge we believe that is going to be very present for our sector over the next decade at least is the need to balance how do we fund the delivery of services right now when they are desperately needed by organizations that cannot keep up with demand, with the competing need to invest in the adaptation that will allow our organizations and our systems to sustain themselves in the future. We do not come at that question with any easy answers. We believe that well-intentioned and smart people will answer that question differently, depending on your analysis and your philosophy. But the basic challenge we have as a sector is to get that balance right. We have to figure out how to balance the need to meet the current demand with the need to adapt and to invest in adaptation. And we know that that cannot happen unless there's a more fact-based conversation between organizations, systems of organizations providing services, and their funders about how financing is flowing in the sector. And that's really why we're committed to this research effort. So let me hand it over to my colleagues who have been furiously writing down as many more questions have been coming in, and see if there's one or two that are particularly interesting that we can take on.
Great. So this is Jen, and I just wanted to respond to a couple other things. For those of you who are still looking on the screen, you'll see that we are scrolling through our survey analyzer. This is the spot. It's at survey.nonprofitfinancefund.org, where you can do your own filtering. So for the person who asked about whether they can see the data by size and sector, if you click on the Edit Filter button at the top, you have the ability to filter the data by any of these things, by state, by sector, by operating expense, by whether the organization has self-identified as Lifeline, about whether they're located in a low-income community and or primarily serving in a low-income community. So great spot for you to look at anything that's of particular interest to you, and it's very easy to use. And if you have any problems with it, do get in touch with us at research@nffusa.org. Again, that's research@nffusa.org. I also just want to reiterate, a number of people asked for the survey slides. The presentation, the longer version of the presentation, is available on our main survey page, which is nonprofitfinancefund.org/survey. It's in the center of the page along with a whole bunch of other resources, including a brochure and a full breakdown of all the results, the answers to all of the questions, the survey methodology, etc. And then the other question that we got that I wanted to just respond to was somebody asked about how we identify the list of issues that were of concern to organizations serving in low-income communities. This is a set of issues that we see frequently as issues for our clients. We serve nonprofits as a CDFI. These are issues that we see our fellow CDFIs working with a lot. This is the first year we have asked that question. We are certainly open to adding items to that question in future years, and so thank you for that question. We will look into that. And I think that's it for me. Anthony, anything else?
Sure. So just I'll combine two questions. Sharon Komu, you made the point that it's quite scary to hear us saying that there's a permanent reset in funding levels. And I'd say we would similarly be scared, except that we take optimism in what we see in our clients and what we see in the survey as a real energy and appetite from nonprofit organizations to respond to this new reality by adapting and evolving. And so that links to a question that actually it was you, Sharon, as well, who said, what is the capacity of nonprofit organizations to respond to this changing environment, and how do we increase it? So I just wanted to take on that question. And again, this goes back to this fundamental challenge we see about organizations that in the best of times run on very thin operating margins. And for many organizations in the survey, breaking even is a goal that they've achieved in the last year, but it's one that they're barely making happen. And so how do you take organizations under those conditions and give them the space to adapt and evolve? And our work, not just from the survey and reading the many inspiring descriptions that came not in the numbers but through the narrative answers to questions, and also in our work across the country with nonprofit clients and with funders, does really give us hope that there is energy and creativity within the nonprofit sector. The challenge that most of our clients and many respondents face is the ability to create time and, frankly, resources in their own organizations to make those adaptive changes, which they're always having to do against the competing pressures of meeting demand right now. And so to answer your question of how do we, we take great heart to see the creativity and effectiveness of our clients when they are given the space. And we do despair, not only on behalf of our clients, but sometimes ourselves as a nonprofit, at how difficult it is to create that space, both for leaders of organizations to have the time to make change, for the kinds of money you need to take the risks that are associated with making change. Your answer of how do we increase that, we in our work believe that funders who recognize the need to provide what we call change capital to their grantees, that's funding that can help them invest in adaptation rather than simply meeting the current demand, is a very important component. So is a management team and a board of the nonprofit that understands finances and is able to have unemotional, fact-based conversations about the ways in which their current programs are inhibiting their ability to respond and adapt. We think that having that basic financial insight is a real precursor to smart adaptation. And at a systems level, we think that this conversation about how do we balance the need to invest in adaptation with the need to meet current needs, the more we can be having this conversation as a sector and not simply waiting for the old ways to work again, will really be the precursor to make that happen. So there's no easy answer. As we outlined in this webinar, there are specific actions we know that adaptation can take. It's about mergers. It's about closing programs that don't work and focusing on the ones that do. It's about investing in interventions at a time where they cost less to prevent than they do to treat. There's a set of things we know that organizations do. There's some creative clients of ours that are using volunteers in a new way to help augment their dwindling human resources that they can pay for. So we know what the playbook is, but we don't have any easy answers, and we look forward to working with many of you over the next few years to figure out what those answers are going to be.
I think that's all for us. We got a question about when the webinar will be posted on our website. It should be posted tomorrow, so maybe check back the end of day tomorrow. And again, if there are any other questions that we haven't answered, do feel free to get in touch with us at research@nffusa.org. We want to thank everybody for listening. We want to thank everybody for participating. And we want to thank Terry Sullivan and the Bank of America Charitable Foundation for supporting this work. We are really gratified to hear all of your stories and to be part of this.
Thank you so much, and we look forward to hearing from you and continuing this collaboration in the future.
Thank you.